The silence inside Golgotha 7, the maximum security orbital prison, was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Outside, space stretched endlessly, a black abyss speckled with distant stars. Inside, it was a steel and concrete hell, a cage built for the worst monsters humanity had ever unleashed. But today, everything changed. A new prisoner walked slowly down the containment corridor, wrists and ankles bound in electronic restraints. His dark orange jumpsuit had a simple inscription on the chest: Elias Kale, genocidal, level 6 security. The eyes watching him from the cells weren't just filled with hate. They were personal. He recognized the faces, saw the scars from the war he had started. Fathers, brothers, sons, survivors from a Martian colony. He wiped out, but Elias didn't flinch. He wasn't here to serve time. He was here to finish what he started. A warmth rose in his throat, and he coughed lightly into his shoulder. When he pulled away, tiny red stains dotted his sleeve. The virus was already working. The countdown had begun. Golgotha 7 was more than just a prison. It was a floating graveyard, a place where humanity's worst were sent to be forgotten, left to rot in the dark with no hope of redemption. Orbital, isolated, unreachable. A sentence here wasn't just about losing freedom. It was about being erased. Elias Kale knew that. He knew every prisoner here had a story written in blood and loss. But unlike the others, he hadn't been sent here as punishment. He was here because he wanted to be. When the guards marched him through the main detention block, the eyes watching him weren't just curious. They were knives pressed against the skin. This wasn't the usual way inmates size up fresh meat. This was something deeper. They knew who he was. You won't last a week. The voice came from one of the upper cells, deep, full of certainty. Elias looked up, scanning the towering figure behind the bars. Around him, the other prisoners started laughing, but there was no humor in it. Just the kind of laugh men have when they've waited too long for something or someone. Up on the observation deck, the prison warden stood with his arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Warren Danton. Elias recognized him instantly. He had the same sharp features as his sister, the woman Elias had sentenced to death, along with hundreds of thousands in the Red Colony. The air was thick with something electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. But Elias didn't flinch. He just walked his assigned cell and sat down on the cold metal cot, ignoring the whispered threats and promises of revenge hissing from the bars around him. Then he felt it, a heat crawling up his throat, a strange tingling in his chest. He turned his head and coughed into his hand. When he pulled it back, tiny red specks dotted his palm. The virus was spreading, and none of them had any idea what kind of hell was about to begin. Time inside Golgotha 7 was measured by cycles of artificial light. There were no days or nights, just the cold flickering lamps in the hallways and the unchanging routine that crushed any sense of time. But that morning, something was different. Elias woke up feeling the weight of fever pressing down on him. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking the collar of his shirt. He didn't need a mirror to know. The infection was spreading faster than he had anticipated. Perfect. He got up slowly, dragging himself toward the bars of his cell. The other inmates were stirring, some shooting wary glances in his direction. The tension hanging over the prison was almost suffocating, as if everyone could sense that something was coming. But they just couldn't name the growing dread yet. Then came the first scream. It wasn't a cry of anger or a fight breaking out. It was something else. A choked, panicked sound coming from the cell next to his. Elias turned his head just in time to see the man clutching his throat, his face twisted in horror, as if he were trying to cough up something burning inside him. His skin was already darkening in patches, his eyes wide, body convulsing uncontrollably. The other prisoners recoiled, murmuring among themselves. Within a minute, the first scream was followed by another, then another. It had begun. The prison alarm blared. Red lights flashed as guards rushed in, barking orders for everyone to back away from bars. But there was nowhere to go. The virus was already here. Elias could see it spreading, the symptoms taking hold throughout the cell block. Up above, in the observation room, Warren Danton watched in silence, his face unreadable, his eyes locked onto the chaos below. He knew, and Elias knew that he knew. Containment doors began sliding shut automatically. Quarantine had been activated. The prison was sealed. No one was getting out, just as Elias had planned. The alarm blared through the prison, its sharp tones blending with the strangled screams of the first infected. The quarantine protocol had been activated. Containment doors slid across the main corridor, sealing off entire blocks. Guards, armed to the teeth, retreated to strategic positions, but by now, Elias knew it was useless. The virus was already inside all of them, leaning against the cold wall of his cell. He watched with a half-smile as the faces around him twisted in panic. The same men who had threatened him days before, whispering promises of revenge, were now consumed by fear. Some banged against the bars, demanding answers, while others just stared at the bodies convulsing on the floor, unable to grasp how fast it was all happening. From the monitoring room above, Warren Danton clenched his fists. He could see it all. The men dropping one by one, the guards struggling to contain the uncontrollable, the infection spreading like wildfire. Sweat dripped down his forehead. He reached for the intercom, his voice cutting through the chaos. All sectors, report status now. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. The system was collapsing. Thermal sensors showed dozens of bodies burning up at unnatural temperatures, while others had already gone cold. A chill crawled up Warren's spine. His brother, his sister, his family, dead at the hands of that monster. And now that same man was here, smiling in his cell, watching it all unfold. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't accept it. With a swift motion, he yanked the master key from his pocket and unlocked the main corridors. Security protocol was clear. No guard was to open the cells without direct authorization from the Earth Union High Command. But Warren didn't care. He stormed down the hall, stepping over the fallen, until he reached Elias's cell. "What did you do?" His voice shook with rage and fear. Elias slowly lifted his gaze, a sickening glint in his eyes. "I ended you all." Warren barely registered his own body moving. His hands clenched around Elias's collar, yanking him forward, slamming him against the bars. The genocidal maniac only laughed, his breath hot with fever. "You know what's funny, Director? I should be dead by now. But somehow I'm still here. And so are you. What do you think that means?" There was irony in his voice, but something else, too. A whispered truth lurking beneath his words. Warren felt his pulse quicken, his chest tighten. His muscles grew heavier. He looked down at his hands. Small black stains were beginning to spread across his skin. Elias just smiled. "Welcome to the new world, Director." Chaos ruled over Golgotha. 7. Flickering lights and the distorted hum of failing systems created a symphony of dread. The prison itself seemed to pulse, as if becoming part of the new organism spreading within its walls. Elias stumbled down the corridors, his body burning with fever. The virus, once his ultimate weapon, now felt like something far beyond his control. His thoughts fractured, breaking into voices, whispers that didn't belong to him. The infection wasn't just consuming bodies. It was evolving, digging into minds, feeding on emotions, fear, regret, hatred. It absorbed everything, twisting it into something tangible. Every prisoner, even those still fighting to hold on to reality, saw their worst nightmares take shape before their eyes. The prison's automated systems, once programmed for absolute control, began behaving erratically. Security panels flashed indecipherable symbols. Guard stations emitted cryptic warnings. It was as if the virus had found a way to communicate, using the station itself as its voice. Even the AI overseeing Golgotha, 7 had begun to break down. Its cold, emotionless directives warped into confused, fragmented messages. The once sterile environment now felt disturbingly organic, pulsing with something alive. Elias fought to hold on to himself, but he felt his identity slipping. The virus wasn't just in his body, it was in his mind. Thoughts that weren't his own bled into his consciousness. He could feel something watching through his own eyes, guiding his steps. Containment barriers started failing, but not in a sudden collapse. It was slow, deliberate, inevitable. The prison, once a fortress, now seemed more like an incubator. Doors that should have remained locked cycled open and shut at random, while alarms echoed in a pattern that felt almost rhythmic. like a pulse. The remaining prisoners wandered aimlessly, their minds unraveling. There was no more order, no more hope of escape. The air itself felt heavy with something irreversible. The prison was no longer a place. It was becoming something else. Elias finally understood. His plan had worked, but not in the way he expected. The virus had outgrown its purpose. It was no longer a disease. It was a mind, a will of its own, a force beyond human comprehension. It had adapted, merged with the station systems, with the prisoners with him. Golgotha. 7 remained sealed, but that wouldn't last forever. The virus had no intention of staying confined. It had learned, evolved, and soon it would reach beyond the prison's walls. There would be no survivors, only change.